Now, next Tuesday, the 1st of December, it will be 60 years since Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, to a white man. Hers is a very familiar name, but she was not the only woman to play an important role in America's civil rights movement. In an interview on Woman's Hour at the end of last year, Professor Angela Davis, known for her activism in the movement in the 1960s, said how rarely the women who fought for their rights are mentioned. In a recent speech, President Obama agreed, saying women made the movement happen. So who were they? Well, Crystal Sanders is Assistant Professor in History and African American Studies at Penn State University. Why do we all know the name of Martin Luther King, but hardly a woman gets a mention?
Part of the blame has to be attributed to the media for influencing our understanding of the movement. In rushing to tell the story, many news outlets missed much of the substance. News outlets focused on charismatic speakers and dramatic events, neglecting the behind-the-scenes individuals who made the story possible. Women often held these behind-the-scenes positions. They did the legwork that went unnoticed by many media accounts. And I think the second reason is because of the nature of their work. Typically, we tend to think of charismatic leaders, charismatic speakers as being our symbols of the civil rights movement. Yet the nature of women's political work makes them unknown. Their participation did not typically consist of making moving speeches or leading marches, yet they were still leaders.
I think President Obama described them as the foot soldiers who worked behind the scenes, organizing things. What exactly did those women do?
They influenced others, they mobilized others, and they ensured that when we saw these images of mass meetings and demonstrations, there would be large crowds of people there. So we have to look at their specific ways of organizing to understand why they were so significant or integral to the movement. And I think one of the first things we can think about is raising money. You know, a lot of times the NAACP is held up as the most important civil rights organization in the country. You know, the NAACP was founded by an interracial group of people in 1909. And for much of the 20th century, it was the NAACP that brought legal suits to dismantle racial segregation in the United States. What we oftentimes forget is that these lawsuits cost money. The NAACP needed a large membership base because membership dues were the primary source of revenue to fund legal challenges. It was women who were going around into rural communities all across the South and encouraging African Americans to join the NAACP. These were women who were setting up chapters and really trying to make sure that the organization had the resources it needed to bring the legal suits that it brought throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s.
Whose are the names that we should know about?
So when I speak of the NAACP, the first name that comes to mind for me is Ruby Hurley. And Ruby Hurley was a black woman who was born in Washington, D.C. in 1909. She started working for the NAACP in 1939, and she's the one who sets up the first permanent NAACP office in the Deep South. She had the responsibility for overseeing membership in 7 southern states. And within 5 years, Hurley's region had more NAACP members than any other region in the country. Increasing membership brought increasing responsibility. It then became Hurley's job to investigate civil rights-related murders and to prepare NAACP plaintiffs to withstand white reprisals. Her behind-the-scenes work was integral in making the NAACP a large, feared, and efficient organization throughout the 1950s and 1960s.
And what about other women who are significant that we should know about?
One of my most favorite heroines of the civil rights movement is Fannie Lou Hamer. And Fannie Lou Hamer was an African-American sharecropper living in the Mississippi Delta. The Delta had probably the highest levels of black disfranchisement in the country, meaning that African-Americans were kept from voting on the basis of their race. In 1962, Fannie Lou Hamer decided that she was going to attempt to register to vote. Unfortunately, she was denied the right to register, but when she gets back to her home, she's fired for her actions and also fires her husband, and they are evicted from the plantation. She becomes a household name in 1964, where she has the opportunity to testify at the Democratic National Convention that was being held in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And so all across the country, Americans heard about the types of intimidation that were used to keep Black Mississippians from exercising their constitutional rights. Another woman that is oftentimes ignored or only mentioned in passing is Daisy Bates. And Daisy Bates was a Black civil rights activist and newspaper publisher from the state of Arkansas. She had helped the Little Rock Nine desegregate the all-white Central High School. Daisy Bates' home served as the headquarters for that desegregation campaign as 9 high school students tried to force the Little Rock School District to enforce the Brown decision. I like to remember Daisy Bates because she was an integral force in a desegregation battle that pitted federal authority against states' rights.
Now, President Obama said that the women were not allowed to be named on paper as running organizations. Why not?
Well, there are many reasons for women's obscurity during the civil rights movement. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Montgomery bus boycott that began on December 1, 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery City bus. When she is arrested, it is a woman by the name of Joanne Gibson Robinson who decides that there needs to be a bus boycott. It's Joanne Gibson Robinson who stays up all night making flyers and distributing those flyers so that African Americans would know not to ride the buses. Joanne Gibson Robinson should have been the face of the boycott. She should have been the spokesman of the boycott. But we know indeed that it was Martin Luther King Jr. who had that role. There are several reasons why Joanne Gibson Robinson was not at the forefront. And the first had to do with her job. She worked for a public university and would likely have lost her job if she became the face of an effort to dismantle bus segregation. So Martin Luther King, serving as a pastor, he had a little bit greater financial freedom to be able to serve as the face and the spokesman of the bus boycott. Another reason is because the boycott operated through the Black church. When Robinson made flyers announcing the boycott, she distributed those flyers to Black preachers. When boycott supporters met to plan and to organize, they met in Black churches. The Black church had a long-standing gender hierarchy that placed men in positions of leadership and women in positions of service. Pastors were male while women were ushers. Men spoke in the church while women sang the songs. Because the boycott operated through the church, that meant the church's gender division of labor had to be respected. So it's these types of reasons that oftentimes led women to fall into the background and to not necessarily receive the recognition that they were due.
Now, some people have said that the gender discrimination and also sexual harassment that occurred within the movement led a lot of these women to turn to the feminist movement in the 1970s. What evidence is there for that?
Well, there is evidence that many of the women who were active in the civil rights movement were also active in the women's rights campaigns that come in the late 1960s and 1970s. But many of these women had been fighting for women's causes long before an organized feminist movement, a new organized feminist movement erupts in the late 1960s and 1970s. So really, we see that a woman like Rosa Parks, as early as the 1940s, was mobilizing and organizing in response to sexual violence in the South. So this was nothing new. What happens, the work we see them doing in the 1970s is nothing new.
How did the women of the period choose which battle to fight, racism or sexism?
I would caution us to make a distinction between the oppression they faced on the basis of their race and the oppression they faced on the basis of their sex, because what we oftentimes find is that these women were committed to eliminating oppression in all forms. And so they themselves did not necessarily separate gender discrimination from racial discrimination. So if we take something like the Montgomery bus boycott, oftentimes we think of this as solely a battle to dismantle racial segregation on city buses. However, many of the women who stayed off these buses did so because they were tired of the sexual harassment they often faced at the hands of white bus drivers. So in our civil rights movement that we think of as an effort to address racial discrimination was for many women an effort to address both racial and sexual discrimination.
Crystal Sanders talked about Ruby Hurley, Fannie Lou Hamer, Daisy Bates, Joanne Gibson Robinson and, of course, Rosa Parks.